You're tuned into The Collective Voice, thought-provoking interviews co-hosted by young adults, fostering deep faith through courageous questions. Welcome to the conversation. Welcome everyone to The Collective Voice. We have arrived in summer. It's hot. Everywhere we go, it seems like it is hot. And so Rudy and I are just getting back from St. Louis, where guess what? It was hot and humid, and it was very humid there last week when we were there. And our guest today is joining from Brooklyn, where it's been hot too. So just everything across the board is hot. So welcome to Hot Girl Summer. Apparently, here we are. So I'm excited that you are joining us for this episode of The Collective Voice. I'm Reverend Phil Dickey, the Director of Congregational Innovation here at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, working with the 787 Collective. And I'm also joined by Rudy. Rudy, welcome.
Oh, thank you. Happy to be here. I'm the Associate for Congregational Innovation. Very excited to be a part of this conversation today. I first heard Reverend Terence Mayo speak at the previous Progressive Youth Ministry Conference. And when I heard him, I was like, man, this person is dynamic. We got to find a way to get him on the podcast so our audience can hear about his impactful ministry. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce him. Reverend Mayo is a Black queer feminist practical theologian, critical educator, and LGBTQIA+ youth advocate. His work bridges theology, racial equity, and social justice through contextual education and community-based strategies. As a Steinhardt Fellow at New York University pursuing a PhD in teaching and learning, Reverend Mayo combines academic rigor with grassroots activism. A sought-after speaker, he has presented nationally on topics such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, public theology, and trauma-informed strategies. He also serves on the boards of Progressive Youth Ministry and the Howard University School of Divinity Alumni Association. Reverend Mayo's interdisciplinary background includes degrees in business, secondary education, and religion. So, Terence, is there anything else you would like to add to your already incredible biography?
Can we just take a second there?
Right.
That's a lot going on, Terence.
Listen, I'm just a Black Southern boy from the south side of Richmond, Virginia. But no, super glad to be with y'all today. Thanks so much for the invitation, and yeah, just looking forward to this conversation.
Can I circle back? There was a lot of adjectives that Rudy started off with there. You said Black, queer, feminist. What were the other ones?
Practical theologian.
Practical theologian. Can we just unpack that for a minute, Terence?
Absolutely. So, Black queer feminism comes out of the meshing of like Black queer theory with Black feminist theory, and puts them together as a way of not only an ethos, of way of being, so like centering justice, centering the lived experience of Black queer folk, but also thinking really intentionally about like intersectionality and justice-based work. So thinking like, how do we lift and center the voices of the most marginalized in our decision-making processes and our policy formation, and also how do we think through the multiple lines of how systems oppress and how we might find freedom and liberation from those systems.
Whew. I feel like that makes me want to just take a nap already, right? That sounds like exhausting work. One of the things we really work with our young adults on is, in the midst of justice work especially, what are you doing to care for yourself, to make sure that you can show up for the fight day in and day out? So you listed a lot of things you're doing, boards you're sitting on, pursuing a PhD. Like, what are you doing to care for yourself in the midst of all of it, Terence?
Oh, I love that question. Since the weather has finally broken in Brooklyn, it is now time to be out in these streets. And the joy of living in New York is just because the vibrancy of the city and the ability to do all the different festivals. It feels like every weekend is a different festival, and it's absolutely amazing because so much of it is free as well. So just enjoying all that the city has offered, the amazing museums, the festivals, the food. Oh my God, the food. And just spending quality time with my my friends who are here, those that love to visit me, because I've been here almost officially a year in a couple weeks, and also making time to get away and see my family and friends back in Virginia and North Carolina where I grew up. So definitely finding time for community, which is I'm really, really big on an intentional community. And also like making time for myself through my spiritual practices, through reading, and yeah, every chance I get, traveling as much as possible.
Terence, I'm curious, what are you reading right now? I actually recently attended a webinar where the speaker talked about how important study is and practice, especially in times of trouble. So what are you studying right now, especially thinking about the practical part as a practical theologian?
Oh, you got to be careful asking a PhD student what he's reading.
I'm sure it's all really, really simple stuff, like nothing too deep.
Nothing too deep, nothing too deep. One of the books I'm reading, I'm like really, really enjoying is Border Crossings, Henry Giroux, which talks about the politics of education and educational justice, and really how that looks within also like the politics of knowledge production and knowledge sharing, which I think is important as we so many times talk about what learning looks like specifically in classrooms, but we actually don't talk about the real politics of knowledge production, especially when book banning is going on, and we're thinking about whose stories are told in the public spheres and whose aren't. So it's really allowing me to kind of think more broadly around the politics of knowledge sharing, production, as we think about like also like popular education in this moment, and what does it really look like to support the critical development of young people, youth around making sense of the world that they live in and naming how politics directly affect them. Because what we know is they are quite aware that things are happening. Sometimes they might not have the language for it, or they might not understand like the systems that are at play. And so as I continue like to do my work, it's also thinking about like how do I create those opportunities, those in spaces to really help young people critically analyze the world, provide language for their experiences, and then think through how do we support them becoming politically active and engaged. The other book I am reading, which is really fascinating, is I'm about to mess up his name. Nope, I got it. Irvin Hunt, his book on dreaming the present, time aesthetics, and the Black cooperative movement. Really impactful book as well, as he talks about one, how do we think about the opportunities in imagination, which for me, I love to live in the world of imagination, also see it as a prophetic tool to sustain us in doing this work. And Phil, you talk a little bit about like, how do I sustain myself and like imagination and radical imagination and prophetic imagination is like one of those things that sustains me. And so thinking about like, what are the limits and the opportunities in imagination, and then how does that play into learning from the historical opportunities and strives. So in Black cooperative spaces, right, there were opportunities for Black people to kind of come together in deep and rich community, and to think through like how do they economically sustain themselves and their families, and to think through like even in those spaces like how they push past some of the systemic barriers, and lastly how even in those communal-based spaces like how education is a pivotal part of doing that cooperative work. So yeah.
Can we stay on imagination for a minute? Because I would love to just dwell a bit on this idea of young people and faith formation in the future, even of the church. And I'm going to say church meaning like whatever the church is emerging into now. And I think that's the idea of merging church with imagination and dreaming up things that we've never even thought of before for the church, the possibilities of the church. Where are you seeing creativity and people living in imagination? And I love that you called prophetic imagination too. I love you brought that side into it as well. But one, what are the practices that help you tap into the imagination? And then two, where are you seeing people really live in the imaginative space?
I love that question. Yeah, because that's so much a part of the work I'm also like crafting. And so, horrible disclaimer. And so part of my work, I have a very long title. So I serve as the Chief Academic Officer and Community Ministry Director. Very long title, right? At Ministry Leadership Center. And so part of what I have been tasked to do, I've been there almost 18 months now, is to really push the organization to think through how do we support young people, faith communities, and reimagining how they respond to local and national justice issues and community-based needs. And so part of that work is I have been designing for the last year a brand new program which enables us to really meet the needs for those who feel a strong sense of call from God to work outside of the four walls of the church, and to think through how do we really support them in their development. Many times what we know is many of our theological education institutions and mainline denominations are still struggling to lean into the now emergent church, which is not the traditional four walls church, right? It is meeting people literally in the community. It is thinking about the material needs of people in a much different way than many churches have done in the past. And so I am using that space to bring together social workers, educators, theologians, community organizers, activists, and we imagined what this work could look like, which was an amazing design sprint. And then we pushed that into now I am like working with curriculum writers to design new theological education courses that will allow us to speak to the needs of what people are saying that they are not finding in a lot of theological education places, and thinking through how do we have some intentional conversations with our denominational and ecclesial partners to say, hey, people are not wanting to spend 3 years to get an MDiv, to potentially work in a church where they're not really able to live into the fullness of what God is asking them to do. So how do we provide spaces and time and resources, which is the big one, for them to live into that? And so I'm excited that work is birthing this fall and the amazing opportunities that are coming from that. I'm also like seeing some just amazing work with our some of our mainline denominations more on a regional base of how they are having the tough conversations as well of like, hey, yes, the traditional sometimes elements of our churches are dying in this way, but is that not fertile ground for God to actually allow us to live into the fullness of the moment? And so I also want to honor that I'm seeing those sparks happening across the country as people are diocesan and ecclesial leaders are really wrestling with, well, what do we do with this property? What do we do with these systems? What do we do with these partnerships that don't really fit us anymore? And how do we live into the tension of the soon coming church and the church that is here? Because part of it also is thinking about some of our partners are still seeing, millennials as young people. And we're like, we have grandkids now. Like, if you still think of us as the young people, that's a very different conversation we need to have. And so some of it is even like challenging how they view young people, their biases, preconceptions, and allowing some fruitful conversations to have about what do we actually know about Gen Z and Gen Alpha already from a sociological point of view and a theological point of view as well.
Really sitting with these different pieces about connectivity, and also circling back to earlier comments you made about popular education. I feel it's so important to understand the language of the people, right? And not fall into this position of like adhering to this banking model of education where you're just trying to deposit information right onto people, as opposed to the more kind of horizontal way, right? The more in community engaged way of going about it, which is dialogical and thinking about connecting with the people in popular education. What are some different on-ramps or different channels like regarding popular education that you observe have been effective at connecting with young adults, and just young people generally in the church and even in the broader world?
Oh, yeah. First, I always invite people to actually accept that all young people are theologians. Like, they are having critical thoughts, ideas, conversations about God, about spirituality, and how they intersect in their worlds. So acknowledging that they're having these conversations, these thoughts. The critical point is, are we giving them space to have those conversations with us? That's typically where the breakdown I see is, and also realizing that young people are fully human and assets to our community, right? And so how do we push past these biased ways of, or deficit ways of seeing young people as less than, or seeing young people up, or yes, they're on a developmental journey, but even in their development, right, they have something to offer us, not once they get 30, not once they get 40, but they have something to offer us now. And so how do we think about the intentionalities of our spaces and removing barriers that might not allow them to actually speak into the spaces and about what they're experiencing. And so some of it is like inviting people in to like shift their way of doing things, and also like inviting them to like, okay, yes, these are all the things we want to accomplish. Now let's slow down. Let's pause. Pre-K pause. Let's pause and actually make sure we're inviting space and time for intentional conversations to happen, and see those just as worthy of any products that we might want to come out of the things that we do. Because sometimes we can be very product driven in Christianity. And that actually pushes past the need for deep community, deep intentionality, and deep conversations. And so like, how do we challenge those modes of doing? Because, all of us can be, we get to, these are all the things I need to knock off my to-do list. And so we have to be productive, but also productivity is capitalism, but I digress.
I think Jesus said, go forth and make products, right? Wasn't that the mandate?
Right. And so like, how do we like pause in that to actually invite intentional conversations? How do we actually teach people to do productive dialogue? That's something that I bring into churches that I've learned in community. And in many of our theological education settings, we don't actually teach our leaders how to do dialogue. And that is a learned skill. And so one of the things I invite in is to sit with leaders, to actually teach them to do dialogue, to do facilitation, and then to go back and teach their communities. So again, when we are inviting people into our churches or having our churches go into communities, we're actually prepared to actually have productive conversations. I think that is one of the ways we can kind of be an on-ramp to help people to live into the necessary skills to do popular education and community-based work. Last thing I would say is also our communities are assets. And so really seeing that, again, thinking about the preconceived biases we might have against young people, against our communities that we serve, naming those biases, working to remediate those biases, and then two, thinking about how do we change our view so we have an asset-based view versus a deficit view. That is kind of like the beginnings of the work that people should think about before they go into communities and try to make change.
Thank you for naming. I think it's hard to place a value on deep conversations and deep relationships like that. The ROI is not really all there typically, right? You can't look at it and say like, we had X amount of conversations and that led to production. You know, like it does. It's kind of almost anti-capitalistic to really invest in deep conversation, that deep relational work. So thank you for naming that and just the challenge that it is, but also the incredible value that it is. I'd love to hear what some of those conversations are entailing. Like, what are you all hearing from these conversations, especially given the political climate that we're in the world here and now, be that domestically or internationally, and what, as you listen and get feedback from those conversations, how that's continuing to form you individually in the work you do, but also the program that you're building.
Yeah. So a lot is being brought up in the conversations. Some of some kind of highlights. What we're hearing is that there are definitely generational divides in theology, in politics, that are affecting people to like have cross conversations, and like those tensions are rising in many different ways, but there's not enough space for actual like intergenerational dialogue to happen, and so like that's rubbing against a lot of different stuff. We're also seeing and hearing many younger people have not the same type of like religious foundation as older generations, and because those formative experiences are not there, again, that's kind of rubbing up against shared language and shared experiences, right? And I think like as you try to make connections with people, shared language and shared experiences are like the thing like your psyche automatically can click on like, oh, we have this in common. And so like the barriers, the walls come down and like you're more open. But now, since so many young people don't have the same formation experiences, there is a greater challenge to find the connections with some of the older generations. Again, because the experiences are not the same, the language is not the same, and so there are a little more barriers and opportunities there. There's also a lot more mistrust from young people's perspective, of religious institutions, and so many of them have not owned up to past harm that has occurred and also tried to repair the harm, or there has been just a lack of actual speaking about the lived realities of what we're facing in our country. And so because the repair of harm has not happened, the challenging of systems is not really happening, and it is also like the sins are not being named. Young people are just like, I don't know about this. And so what we kind of know, Pew did some research, I think it came out like last year. So the younger generations now are, what they are or currently seeing is these generations will be the first in recent history that when they leave Christianity, they don't come back. And so we've seen these like reciprocal systems socially in the past where people leave Christianity, right, for many different reasons, but eventually they come back. And so the early data is showing us that they're not coming back, and they have no plans of ever coming back. And so part of that is because of those three things I kind of named. And so how do we kind of proactively name those in this moment, I think, is what we're trying to see. And for me, that is also thinking through how do we allow for a more diverse and expansive view of spirituality and the intersections of spirituality out of kind of traditional structures and traditional norms, and allow people to kind of actually like play. I always remind, especially when I'm working with older adults, of like, actually, let's take some pedagogical moments here just to play. And they're just like, Terence, I'm a 50-year-old bishop. I don't play. And I'm like, that's the problem.
Therein lies the problem.
Therein lies the problem. I'm like, no, let's actually like play so you can actually remember parts of who you are, parts of your childhood, parts that give you joy. Let's actually take some time to play. And then like moving them through the opportunity to, like, even in that play, to think through like, how does play open us up to actual dream again and reimagine? Or as like Robin D.G. Kelly talks about like freedom dreaming. How does that, there's something that happens in our bodies ontologically when we play that actually allows us to actual dream and imagine again. And so that being kind of the place where, again, not only am I inviting leaders to do and being part of their faith integration processes, but also me and myself, like, you might have saw, I think it was on TikTok maybe last year or maybe 2 years ago, you just saw Black men frolicking. And it was just like, and just seeing other Black men like, we can frolic? And like, and you see like Black men in fields like, I'm frolicking. Like, and there's the amount of joy that was on their face, how their bodies were literally like, you could see the joy like literally moving throughout their bodies. And so like, like I said, even for me, it's hot girl summer. So like, I'm going to go frolic now because that's part of my spiritual practice.
Amen to that. That's all I'm going to say to that. Just amen to that.
Absolutely. Like, I saw a video of Vic Mensa, the artist, frolicking, and I was like, yeah, I need to go do that. But on the topic of play and finding alternative spaces, right, and practicing faith in ways that are alternative to these traditional modes that people have come to understand Christianity, like, what are some effective and meaningful ways that you've seen young adults in ministry practice their faith beyond, the church walls in ways that are life-giving to them?
Yeah. I am always like really, really encouraged when I am able to participate in Children's Defense Fund's work. And so for those that don't know, Children's Defense Fund has been around for decades, and their work really is one part policy and one part running freedom schools around the country. And freedom schools have a long history within the African American church of ways, again, we were doing popular education, we were having mentoring programs, we were doing food justice and things like that. So freedom schools in the contemporary settings through the Children's Defense Fund allow churches and faith communities to partner up to provide after school and summer programs that allow young adults to mentor and teach youth in their communities. And it's a beautiful expression of intergenerational knowledge production, but also like faith formation that is really centered in contextual ways of being and knowing, which is super important. And it is grounded in music and arts and joy, because hashtag we need Black joy. And so it's wrapped in all of that. So it really pushes not only the young adults that are leading these freedom schools, but it also pushes the older adults that might not know all the things that they sign up on to reimagine or to re-see what's possible in churches and in our faith community. So it's always amazing to sit with those young adults and to see how by leading those freedom schools, they then find their own voices in their communities and kind of go back into, typically they're college students, right? So they go back to their colleges and just like have a much more stronger identity around culture, around faith, around justice, and also to see the beautiful ways that they see themselves connected to lineages of faith, which I think, is important because, someone would say, oh, we're in a faith crisis. I don't like that language. I don't like it. I don't think it's a crisis. I think it is really young adults helping us to push past how we have got locked into ways of doing and being. And so I love how the young adults are like formed through that. I also see like in our organizing spaces, so during the when Black Lives Matter was coming on to the scene and the work around justice was happening, being part of that early work and seeing both the challenges of really, really community-based work and the opportunities. And one of the beautiful things I saw out of that is as well, as people were thinking about what does it really look like to be like community and organizing chaplains. And so seeing young people again step into those roles without, again, I am all for constructive contextual theological education. And seeing how they were coming into those roles many times without all of this, traditional ways of training, but really thinking about what are the elements that we learn from the Black Panthers? What are the elements that we learn from the Lords? What are the elements that we learn from the Highlander Center? What are all these elements that we know from our elders and our ancestors that they did to actually provide care in community organizing activist spaces? And then how do we make that our own? And so literally seeing how they were birthing pedagogy and curriculum and providing like new faith spaces literally in the street was like super, super inspiring and life-giving. And it was like, okay, like this is the work. Like this is reimagining the church in the moment, in context, which was like absolutely beautiful to see and participate in and be engaged in.
You mentioned a few resources there, but for people who are listening now who've been curious about the idea of organizing and just aren't really sure where to start, like tapping in the ancestors, I think is a great potential like way to start into that. But what are other resources and other ways that you'd really suggest somebody who's really curious about just getting into this work, how to take that first step?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the first steps I always invite people to do is to reflect on what are the issues that are really speaking to them in this moment. And then kind of being able to start to name them and also to name their why, of why, those particular things are speaking to them, helps to start the process in reflection, which is so super important. And I think the next thing is, while I think national work is super, super important, it's also important to remember a wonderful way to start the work is to start very, very local. Because that local context is so important, right? Because, we think about racial justice. That's a really big thing. It's a really big thing. And it can be also like really hard to like wrap sometimes our minds and our hands around what that looks like. So I also remind people like, okay, let's take a step back. What's happening in your community related to the thing that is speaking to you in this moment? Who's actually doing work around that? And just have conversations. Google is our friend. And it's so easy, so much more easy nowadays because you can literally Google like racial justice organizations in Brooklyn. And like, boom, you got a list of 5 or 10 sometimes, and just go check them out. Like, go to some of their programming, show up, be in deep community, learn about the issues, and then slowly to get acclimated in their work. And then that way you will find a home. And then once you find a home, then begin to think about like, how does this work look for you? One of the things I always remind young people is the work will always be there. So don't think you have to solve the world's problems overnight. It's actually impossible. First, to do this work, it requires all of us to do this work in different ways, in different seasons of our lives. That changes, right? But being in community allows us to do it sustainably. So first reflect on what's speaking to you in this moment, and then begin to look in your local community to see what organizations are doing that work. Get active with them, start to learn, start to grow, and then figure out where your words and actions will show up in that work.
That's so good. I think there's been a shift where it used to be that we would believe ourselves into belonging. We would find those who had common beliefs as us, and then you'd join a church or whatever your faith community was that aligned with your beliefs, and that's where you found your place. Those are your people. And we were in conversation with a guy in Seattle who's been doing some organizing work, a young adult there. And he said, I see all these young adults at these organizing events, and like very few, if any of them, are any sort of religious or faith-based. And I just don't see the faith community engaged in this. But he's like, I really see young people are acting their way into belonging as opposed to believing their way into belonging. And I just think that's a really interesting shift that we're, again, talking about generational shifts you were talking about in different foundations. I think that's one we're witnessing as well.
And Terence, you sat on the Progressive Youth Ministry Board for a few years now, where Phil and I are new members.
Shout out PYM.
Shout out PYM. That's right. So how can Progressive Youth Ministry, in this heavy, very challenging political moment, serve as a catalyst for transformation?
So many ways. But what do we have capacity to do? I think, like, first and foremost, by us actually getting back to having an annual gathering, that's an important step in this moment, because what we know is people don't need safe spaces, they need brave spaces. And so like that annual gathering, which happens every fall, is a brave space for us to not only have conversation, but have resource sharing around justice, inclusion, and liberatory practices. And I think that resource sharing is a pivotal part of the moment, because I love my fellow faith leaders, but many times we can get trapped in the discussions about the work and not actually doing the work. And so through resource sharing, we're actually allowed to think through, okay, yep, we've done this amazing program in our community. Wonderful. Tell me more about it. What were the barriers? What were the resources that you used? What were the outcomes? And like, how do you did it right? So in that, it's a different type of discussion and also a different type of sharing which leans into hopefully people feeling like they're leaving with tangible resources to take back to their communities and enact some forms of change. What we also kind of know about those that in our recent years have come to PYM is many of them are coming and going back to spaces where they may be the only progressive voice in their church or in their local community. And so part of it also is a respite for them, is a place of care where they can actually I'm in a place where I can actually let down my guards, and I can find joy, I can find care, I can find a sense of well-being. So I am then girded up, old church language, girded up to go back into my communities and enact change. And I think we saw a lot of this, again, that came out of the George Floyd movements, where we saw a huge amount of burnout in community organizing and activists. And as we kind of responded through organizing chaplaincy and things like that, we really saw this need to make sure we had tangible resources and supports to think about the social, the psychological well-being that needs to happen. And so PYM is a resource sharing space, a brave space, and a place for people to provide care, which again is that other third element that I think more and more, especially faith-based organizations, need to actually put resources behind, which is important. Because even in my work, I have talked to, especially as I do the work of LGBTQ inclusion in churches, one of the things I invite churches to think about as they are on their journey to being open, affirming, and inclusive is actually you have LGBTQ folk in your congregation already. Because you are early in the process or maybe late in the process and haven't actually done a lot of the work, harm is still happening to them, whether you want to accept it or not. And because harm is happening to them while you are going through your institutional process, how are you actually giving back to their care? And so challenging them to, yes, do the work of inclusion, of openness, and tangibly support LGBTQ people as their needs are happening. So I'm thinking about not only their material, but their psychosocial and the spiritual as well.
Who's doing that well?
Listen.
No pressure.
It's a work in progress. I think we have some denominational based groups like Next Church and Pride in the Pews, who's doing good work around that too, and the Open Affirming ONA, I just know they call it ONA, UCC, are really doing good work around programmatical changes, around shifting cultures as well, which is needed. The second part of the work is not being done enough. We need much more work to be done to support the psychosocial, the material realities of LGBTQ people in these spaces, especially our young people. Because what we also know, the national data kind of talks about, while COVID in many ways took the lid off of a lot of the stuff that were happening with young people, one of the things it really highlighted is that there is, I don't use this word lightly, but there is a mental health epidemic for our young people in our country. And it's real. And even amongst that, what we see is among our LGBTQ youth, those figures are way higher they skyrocket. And then if you take it a step further, when you look at Black and brown LGBTQ youth, it's scary. It is really scary. And so what we know is faith communities can either be the spaces where young people find care, respite, be seen, or they can be the place which causes catastrophic harm. And so part of what I would love to see in our faith communities is we really take seriously the needs for mental health support, trauma-informed training, mental health first aid training, mental health resources, right, for young people, for LGBTQ youth, so they can actually have their needs met, both materially, but also by clinically trained practitioners as well.
Terence,
just saving the world, just saving the world.
It can feel very bleak, but you've left us with this wisdom, and it definitely shine a light for us to ask more critical questions and to pursue, these different strategies, trauma-informed strategies, seeing our communities, especially our young peoples, as assets rather than a group representing a deficit, right? And meeting people where they are, and really bridging study and practice together. So you've left us with so many nuggets of wisdom, and I thank you for that. And I feel like I'm leaving this conversation with better questions, honestly, to pursue in this difficult moment.
And some great resources. Thanks for
Absolutely.
sharing those. I will say one kind of just maybe shameless plug. We call it's progressive youth ministry, but we refer to it as PYM a lot of times because it's more than just youth ministry that we're doing now. So this year, for the first year, we'll have kind of a track within a track. So progressive youth ministry will have a track that focuses on children's ministry for those who are engaged in children's ministry. There will still be youth ministry as a big source and topic, and we're also hosting a young adult ministry track as well. And so a big part of why Rudy and I are on the board of PYM is because we're designing and building out this track for young adult ministry. So if you are a young adult, if you are in young adult ministry, whether that's specifically young adult ministry, you're a young adult just doing ministry in general, we'll have a track that will be designed specifically for you. And so November 13th through the 15th, it's in Austin, Texas. We would love for you to come join us and be a part of the Progressive Youth Ministry Conference. Terence is going to be there, so how can you not come join?
There.
Well, Terence, seriously, thank you for your time today, and for like Rudy said, it's leaving me with a lot more questions as well. And so I feel like there will be more conversations we have with Terence in the near future, definitely at PYM, but just like I feel like we could have a whole conversation just around community organizing. Maybe we'll have to have a panel discussion at some point, because Rudy's got good background in community organizing, what that really means for the church too. But another conversation for another day. So thank you for giving us, just like Rudy said, lots of nuggets of wisdom today, and we're really grateful for all the work you're doing.
Thank you.
Friends, go in peace. Actually, any blessings, any benedictions you want to share with the people?
Oh, sure. You put me on the spot.
Put you on the spot for this. I trust you. I believe it. I know you got one.
I would also say, if people want to connect, feel free to do so. You can find me on LinkedIn, Terence Mayo. You can find me on all the socials. I think Brave Educator 06. So yeah, I love to keep the conversations going. I invite you into whatever posture feels good to your body and your spirit in this moment. One of the prayers that I kind of go back to several times a year is out of the New Zealand Anglican Church, their Lord's Prayer. So I invite you to hear these words, and may it nourish your spirit in this moment. Eternal Spirit, Earth Maker, Pain Bearer, Life Giver, Source of all that is and that shall be, Father and Mother of us all, loving God, in whom is heaven. The hallowing of your name echo through the universe. The way of your justice be followed by the peoples of the world. Your heavenly will be done by all created beings. Your commonwealth of peace and freedom sustain our hope, and come on earth. With the bread we need for today, feed us. And the hurts we absorb from one another, forgive us. In times of temptation and test, strengthen us. From trials too great to endure, spare us. From the grip of all that is evil, free us. For you who reign in the glory of the power that is love, now and forever. Amen.
My
Amen.
goodness. Amen to that, Terence. We will link to your social media, LinkedIn, so folks who want to connect with you can find you there. We'll also put Ministry Leadership Center there as well. So again, thank you for your time, and I do hope, listeners, that you will connect with Terence. It's a good man. Good man. Appreciate you.
Thank you all.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Collective Voice, the premier podcast of the 787 Collective. For more information, visit us at 787collective.org or find us on social media. And if you enjoyed what you heard, be sure to subscribe, rate us, and share a review. For when you do, you're tricking the algorithm for the common good.